This week, the Justice Department announced its latest of many, many settlements with the felonious big banks that rule our economy. The repercussions of that announcement were limited to, a few headlines here and there and some scattered protestations from lefty causes and lefty centers of power. While that's good, people should protest this, it's not nearly enough. We need to understand once and for all that our financial system isn't just corrupt in practice, it's corrupt by design, and the problem is getting worse. Let's connect the dots using some news items just from the past few weeks. First of all, let's talk about this latest deal. Four of the world's biggest banks pleaded guilty to felony charges this week and agreed to pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.6 billion in fines. They did this because they fixed the price of foreign currencies and illegally defrauded people. In so doing, Justice Department officials made a big deal out of the fact that this was different from their previous sweetheart deals with Wall Street, because this one required the bank's parent companies to enter a guilty plea. Sure, that's an improvement over previous deals, but it's not as significant as it might have been because the settlement wasn't finalized until the banks were able to strike side agreements with regulators that made sure they'd still be able to keep doing business as usual despite now being convicted felons. In other words, it was ensured that the banks would come to no harm and suffer no penalty as a result of their admitted felony behavior. Now, one of the institutions involved in this deal was Citigroup, which you may remember was created as a result of a bipartisan Republican and Democratic deal and has been populated by many leading advisors to Democratic administrations. Another was JP Morgan Chase. Now, Chase's CEO is named Jamie Dimon, and he was lionized for many years, even after the financial crisis, by politicians and members of the mainstream media, many of whom insisted that Dimon was smarter and more ethical than his peers. There is now a considerable body of evidence to contradict that assertion, and that body of evidence keeps on growing. In fact, all four of these banks are repeat offenders with long records of serial fraud, and it doesn't show any sign of ending soon. In fact, there was a report just this morning pointing out that the banks were required to send out disclosure notices to their clients, but nowhere in the disclosure notices of some of the bad behavior that did not lead to felony charges do they promise not to do it again. In other words, they are likely to keep up the bad behavior. So what are we to make of all of this? Clearly, Wall Street's bad behavior is not about to change. In fact, this week, Bank of New York Mellon Corporation agreed to pay $180 million to settle another type of foreign exchange related activity. This was a class action lawsuit. This followed on $714 million in an earlier settlement. In other words, Bank of New York Mellon has paid about $1 billion for writing pension funds and other institutional clients, overcharging them for currency transactions. So they defrauded these guys. Now, JP Morgan Chase, let's talk about them a little more. Here's one that seemed to slip under the public radar. In March, they agreed to pay more than $50 million over RoboSign documents. Now, what's a RoboSign document? That's where the bank knowingly mass produces statements to court. In other words, statements to court sworn in, saying that they've reviewed certain documents and found them to be accurate, so they're going to turn somebody out of their home. Now, when you tell a court that you've reviewed a document and you really haven't, that's perjury. They did that about 50,000 times, and it was also noted by the Justice Department that more than 25,000 of these notices were signed with the names of former employees who didn't even work there anymore, or of employees who had nothing to do with reviewing the accuracy of these filings. That's another 25,000 counts of perjury against JP Morgan Chase. Many people lost their homes unfairly as a result. Now, this is where I have to speak a sentence that for too long has been obligatory in stories of this kind. And the sentence goes like this. The Justice Department did not announce the indictment of any individual bankers, for the crimes which led to this settlement. No, no, in the world of collusion between Justice Department attorneys and bankers, apparently these felonies commit themselves and nobody is really guilty. Now, another survey came out this week of bankers in Great Britain and on Wall Street, and it found that their willingness to commit crimes has grown. Their awareness of first-person awareness of crimes committed by their colleagues has grown. In other words, crooked bankers aren't born, they're made. How are they made? They're made with incentive plans that are designed to encourage the making of money at any cost. There are very few clawbacks when it turns out that that money was made illegally. There is very little in the bankers' incentive plans to ensure that they behave ethically. They are not, for example, before they get their bonuses, reviewed to see if they've followed all the rules. So let's put it this way. A system which rewards antisocial behavior leads to social tragedy. It's also a law enforcement nightmare. Criminology 101 says that when you get rewarded for criminal behavior and you don't get punished for it, that almost inevitably leads to more crime. The principle is deterrence, and there has been no deterrence on Wall Street. The old song says you've got to be carefully taught, and this lesson apparently hasn't been lost on the newest generations of bankers. The authors of this survey said the following, quote, "We are particularly dismayed by the ethical standards of the most junior employees in the industry," end quote. In other words, you think things are bad now, look to the future. On top of that, banks are just as big a portion of the economy as they were before the financial crisis. They are taking just as big a share of corporate profits as they did before they crashed the economy and ruined things for everybody else. Starting salaries for new employees on Wall Street are way up. We could go on, but the principle is this. The bad guys are winning, and they'll keep winning until we demand that our government do something about it. Until then, the principle on Wall Street is going to be, who says crime doesn't pay? It pays really well. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.